Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Ely.
And I'm Daniel Chen, which is a couple guys talking about some stuff.
The stuff we've been talking about for the last several weeks is a biblical theology on race. We have been going through the main storyline of the Bible, creation, fall, redemption, consummation, and talking about how that storyline informs how we have talks about race, racism, and ethnic sins and theology. So we've come to the last part of that, part 4, consummation, today. So we're excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I think this will be, hopefully, this structure, this paradigm we've given you is really helpful because, even we've used a biblical paradigm and inserted an issue into it instead of the other way around.
Right.
So I know it's been helpful for me to, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I know we've been discussing this for a year or two, and it's been really helpful for me personally just to organize my thoughts in this way. I feel like I can have a conversation better with someone now, bringing it in with this paradigm.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. But before we get into it, as always, we begin with the life hack.
So my life hack is for those who have kids. And this is something my wife and I have done recently, and it is get a zoo membership. And a zoo membership, it's been awesome. So basically a zoo ticket's like, at least in Atlanta, I know we got people who listen that aren't in Atlanta, but I'm sure this is the same if you live in a big city. It's like $30 or so for a ticket, for adult ticket, and then like 20 something bucks, $22 or something for
expensive.
A kid.
Yeah.
So it's going to run you close to, if you have 2 or 3 kids, it's going to run you about $100 to go. Mm-hmm. It's one time. Well, we got like the super special zoo membership. You get 3 adult tickets, 4 kid tickets, and 2 one-time passes, and it's like $180.
There you go.
That means that as long as you go twice, you've saved money.
There it is.
And the zoo is a really great place to take the kids. You don't have to go all day. If you just need like something to do, you want to get out of the house for a couple hours, you drive down there. It's a few bucks for parking. You walk around the zoo. You don't even have to do the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But the zoo, the Atlanta Zoo also has like events for adults. And I'm pretty sure like with our season passes, we can get in. They'll have like,
that's awesome,
like food tasting or wine tasting or whatever nights. And so I know especially, my wife stays at home the majority of the time, and it's just nice for her to go with people in the neighborhood or whatever. They need something to do.
Go to
the zoo together. And you know what it costs? Nothing, because you paid one time for it.
Right.
And it's something to do. So if you are looking for something to do with your kids, I would highly recommend the zoo like season passes. We've
done the same thing with Stone Mountain.
Really?
Yeah. You can do season passes, and they have all kind of attractions, like this big dinosaur thing, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, season passes, just good life hack in general.
Yeah, season passes.
If you have kids, depending on what it is.
Little kids, right? Yeah. Because if once all the kids are in school, it's hard to go to things.
Right.
But if you got little kids, it's really a great thing.
Go for
and Stone Mountain passes, how much is a Stone Mountain season pass? Do you know? I feel like it's not that bad.
No, it's like
because you pay for the car, right?
or something. For the car, for a season pass for the parking is $50.
Okay.
And for like a one time, it's like $25 or $30.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So and then there's separate like attractions, and that's like another $40 or something per person.
That's not bad.
But it's like $30 per person per time if you do it.
Yeah.
So after 2 times, it easily pays for itself.
Stone Mountain.
That's you got the Christmas stuff and.
Oh yeah, that's great.
So
yeah.
And second segment we got for the podcast today is the book of the month. So mine is the book Providence by John Piper. I was given this by Mike and Jan Forrester for Christmas. Thank you guys very much. It is a very large book. We're talking 700-something pages.
Yeah.
And it's like John Piper's magnum opus. I mean, he traces the providence of God, which he calls God's purposeful sovereignty. He traces it through the whole Bible and shows how God's providence is on display. And it's a pretty meaty theological work, but it's really good. So Would highly recommend it. And probably, honestly, the best way to read it is just a little bit at a time. I mean, just read it. Like, if you tacked it onto your devotions, make it your goal for a whole year to read Providence, and read 2 or 3 pages after each devotion in the morning. That'd be a good way to tackle it.
And my book of the month is a book called Influence. And, part of me is like, I don't want to recommend this book because I want to keep the secrets to myself, but it's just so good. Basically, this guy is a social psychologist, and he wanted to know, why do sales techniques work, basically.
Sure.
And so he went undercover to work as selling magazines or whatever, or into a store. And he learned, he has 7 ways that you can influence the way people make decisions you can basically tap into people's subconscious, and you can get them to do things, basically.
Sure.
And I know that sounds like manipulation, but it's not. It's different because
it's manipulation with a purpose.
It's manipulation with a purpose. No, I mean, it's just funny. As I think about this manipulating, the idea of manipulating, yes, manipulation with evil intent is evil. Right? But if you think about it, we're constantly all quote unquote manipulating each other all the time. But mostly it's just not for sinful, evil reasons and ways. You know what I mean? I'm even thinking about hey, where do you want to go to dinner? You are with whatever response you are. I want this, or I don't know, or whatever. You're influencing the decision of the person who asked.
Sure.
Right? What I'm saying is you can call anything manipulation, but it's not, right? So, yes, you can take this and use it in an evil way. So, I guess put that disclaimer out there. But no, it's just really helpful to understand the human mind and how you can, if you are in sales, or if you're just a normal person that wants to influence people in any way. This is a great book.
There you go. Good recommendation. So for the last 5 weeks, or last 4 weeks, we've been talking about the biblical storyline and how it relates to race. So we started with the doctrine of creation and how we're created in the Imago Dei. Before there are any racial or ethnic differences, we're created in the Imago Dei. So what does that mean for race? We'd encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast. Second chapter is the fall. And we've talked about how mankind, created in God's image for God's glory, fell into sin, deciding to glorify ourselves rather than God. And all of creation has been under a curse since then. And so we've talked about how the doctrine of the fall has related to our sin, specifically ethnic sins, how we can sin against one another ethnically. So we talked about that. Then part 3 of this was redemption. So how Christ coming, redeeming a people for himself, changes the conversation on ethnicity and race. And last week we talked specifically about applications of the doctrine of justification and how that changes the conversation on race and ethnicity being one in Christ. What does that mean to be one in Christ? Neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. So, and we've used a lot of Shai Lin's book, The New Reformation, throughout this process. Today we want to come to the last chapter in the biblical story, and that is consummation. Some people call it restoration, some people call it new creation, but it's the end. And we see this in Revelation 21. John says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." So what we see at the end of the Bible, the last chapter of the last book, Technically, chapter 22 is the last chapter, but metaphorically speaking, consummation. Christ comes, he restores the new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem, which lasts forever. Death is no more, pain is no more, sin is no more, and we live and dwell with God in resurrected bodies forever. That's the end. That's where this story of the world is going. And shortly before that in Revelation 7, this helps kind of relate ethnicity and race to the conversation. We have what's called the great multitude from every nation, right? And so John says in Revelation 7, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.' And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, 'Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen.'" So this is the picture we're getting. This is what's pointing toward the end. This is what we can expect in a redeemed heaven, a redeemed new heavens and new earth, is a great multitude from every nation, from all tribes, from all peoples, from all languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, Jesus, worshiping. So how this relates to ethnicity, two interesting points, right? First is this: diversity is a part of the picture of the consummation, right? Every peoples, tribes, languages, nations. But it isn't the focus of the picture. The Lamb is the focus of the picture.
Yeah, Jesus is.
Yeah.
Christ is the focus of the picture.
Yeah.
And I think this is really important because I have had this verse quoted to me a lot from people. So we're about to get into the main points of today, and I'll wait to make my point until we get there. But it is an interesting thing because I think when you shift the focus, you're gonna come to wrong conclusions.
Right.
So remember, Christ is the focus. What is the focus of our worship? Is it how we worship or who we worship?
Mm-hmm.
It's who we worship.
Right.
Yeah.
Another way to put that point is diversity is a great part of the new heavens and the new earth, but it isn't the greatest part. God is.
Yeah.
So we definitely see where we're headed, where the biblical storyline is headed. In the consummation, in the new heavens and the new earth, the renewal of all things, we will enjoy being a part of a great multitude from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation. Every ethnicity on the face of the earth that you could imagine will be there. But our focus isn't, man, this is so cool how diverse it is. And that is going to be cool. The focus is going to be, God is amazing. We get to worship him. We get to see him. So it's really important when we have these conversations because sometimes we talk about race and ethnicity from the Christian worldview as though diversity was the end goal.
Right.
And like diversity was the consummation. Like the main part of the new heavens and the new earth is that it's diverse.
Right.
And we're saying that is a part of the new heavens and the new earth that we want to celebrate and rejoice, and that's amazing. But God is the main part. Sinful human beings being redeemed and being in the presence of God, that's the main thing to look at and enjoy.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. So the previous ministry I worked for, this was like a big thing that was pushed for like 3 or 4 years. This was around 2015, right? So, a few years before even when the powder keg exploded last summer, kind of deal. And, I would say that was probably the point you just made, the thing that kind of drove me crazy the most. Mm-hmm. Was diversity was almost like the trump card. Like that word,
Yep.
You can't, like, if I'm promoting something that is promoting diversity, well, that's the end goal of the Christian life, isn't it? So
Right.
you can't ever have
Question
and you can't ever have an opposing view. That's not to say diversity is bad, but to say maybe that's not the end goal of what we're trying to get to.
Right.
And it was crazy. It's been used. It's been used as a trump card. I've seen a lot.
Yep.
And so I think what we're going to talk about today is that plus the overreaction to that, overcorrection of that, maybe.
Right.
Yeah. So that is an overcorrection of where the culture is. And then there's another group of people that almost like overcorrect that overcorrection. And that's like the two camps you have. So.
There's overcorrection and overcorrection squared.
Right. Yeah.
So what we do want to talk about, so the end, right, is a redeemed, a new heavens and a new earth, filled with God's redeemed people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation, in resurrected bodies, no death, no sadness, no sickness, no pain, enjoying God, worshiping Him forever. Incredible. So we want to talk about two things. We want to talk about, number one, the dangers of an over-realized eschatology, and two, the dangers of an under-realized eschatology. So eschatology is the doctrine of the end, right? So this consummation, how you understand that. Currently, we live in what's called the already but not yet.
Right.
Right? We already have received Christ and redemption, but we have not yet received the fullness of His kingdom and His redemption focus, and all that comes into play in the last chapter, consummation.
Right.
So the dangers of an over-realized eschatology are asking the question, what happens when we pull too much of Revelation 21 and 22 into our present day?
Yeah, so eschatology is your end times view, right? So how does the end impact now? And it has significant
impact.
And so it has significant impact because what you think is going to happen, right? What you're heading towards in your life shapes what you do today.
Yes.
Right?
So that picture of Revelation 7, every tribe, tongue, language, nation, worshiping before the throne. What happens when we pull that to today too much? That's over-realized eschatology, so we're going to talk about that first. And then two, the dangers of under-realized eschatology. What happens when we don't think about that enough,
right,
and apply that to our current context?
Yeah.
So there's dangers, there's,
and
hits on both sides.
So to summarize, what happens when the future promise that God gives us in Revelation affects the way we live now? Or what happens if we don't ever think about the future and we let the present shape the present things now, right?
Yeah.
So
the dangers of an over-realized eschatology related to ethnicity, I guess we could say race and ethnicity.
Right.
There are a lot of, we could talk, we'll probably do a series on eschatology because this series hasn't created enough controversy.
Yeah.
So we'll move to eschatology.
Does Revelation talk about helicopters?
Are you going to get left behind? Have you already been left behind? Are we in the end times now?
That's what no one talks about.
Right.
What if everyone here has been left behind?
What if the rapture has happened? Another series. Just wait. So, dangers of an over-realized eschatology. Number one, we think we can eliminate racism. And I don't mean like specific laws that are specifically racist. I mean this notion that, hey, we're finally the generation that we can stop people from ever being racist.
Right.
And I would say no, because people are people.
Right.
And people are sinners.
I mean, this goes back to the podcast we did on sin, that that othering mentality is from our sinful nature that never stops.
Right. So as long as there are sinners in the world, there's going to be sin.
Right.
And a very common sin is ethnic sin. So
right.
I think an over-realized eschatology would say we can get rid of this. Like I hate to use this analogy, but it's kind of like COVID-19. That thing's not going away.
Right.
We did. I think early on we thought, hey, if we can deal with this right, we can like get rid of this thing.
Right.
I think a lot of people are coming to embrace like this is going to be kind of with us for a long time.
It's a good analogy because the vaccine is kind of the thing that people think that if I can just apply my application of the scriptures, that's like the vaccine. And if everyone did this, it'd all go away.
And it's like, no, even if you did, it's probably not, because it's a virus and it's going to morph. And right, so sin is an ugly thing, and it is in the heart of sinners. So that would be...
And I want to say, if you're thinking right now, like, okay, well, if sin's never going away and racism is never going to go away, I guess we should just do nothing then. And we're like, no, wait.
Just wait.
Just wait till point two.
Wait for point two.
Wait for point two.
Put your seatbelt on. Calm down. Stop yelling at us.
Yeah.
You're driving your child in the car. What kind of example are you being right now?
Yeah.
Don't yell at your pastors.
Exactly. And plus, I'm
down.
a minority, so just think about that, you know?
I can't believe you would do that to me. So another thing, I think, if we have an overrealized eschatology, we try to produce on this side of eternity what can only be produced in the new heavens and the new earth. We think we as fallen, sinful humans can produce a utopia that only God, through the power of Christ and the consummation, can produce.
Yeah, and I think... not just even in racism, but I mean, like talking about race or ethnicity, this is the interesting thing about our culture that we forget, right? So as we approach a overly secular world, a secularist world is a world without God. When you take out God, you also take out sin and sinful nature.
Yep.
And when you take out sinful nature, your policies and the thing you think you should happen is a utopia. And when the utopia doesn't happen, you're confused.
Right.
And it all starts with misunderstanding a holy God and then a sinful world.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we think can happen too, even as Christians, is if we are oversizing the new heavens and new earth now, we expect the world to operate as new heavens and new earth when the current world isn't there yet.
Right. And we freak out with, I just can't believe, like, it's so interesting, right? In this conversation, how many times have you heard, like, I just can't believe, fill in the blank.
Right.
And it's like, you know what? I mean, in some ways that's legitimate, because I think you think, I thought we made so much progress in this area of our culture, and it just seems like we were back, to ground zero or whatever. But in another way, it's like, yeah, you're dealing with humans. Like, fallen, sinful humans are capable of pretty horrible things. So start believing, because sinful humans do pretty sinful stuff. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see brokenness in our world. That's par for the course.
Right.
And so an over-realized eschatology brings what can only be accomplished in the new heavens and the new earth, and makes it an expectation for today.
Yeah, and I think too with this, that I think is interesting as well, and this is leading into the next point a little bit, but, I had always heard, like, we have to implement this perfect world now, right? In Revelation 7, that we see in Revelation 7. But the issue with Revelation 7 is, we can't know for sure exactly what new heavens and earth is going to look like. Not 100%, right?
Right.
So we even say, like, for example, everyone will be from every nation, tribe, and language. And I've had that spoken to me to say, now that means you have to have in your ministry, in your church, and once again, this is going into the next point. I'll just read it.
Yeah, you just go to the next point. Yeah.
Our next point is, we make the diversity of heaven a requirement for every nook and cranny of society. For example, a local church must be as diverse as their community.
And the key word there is must.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of practical issues with that statement to me.
Sure.
But part of it is, for example, in Revelation 7, it doesn't say we're going to be worshiping as every nation, tribe, and language, but people from them, every tribe, language. The gospel's for everyone in all the world, and they're going to come from those different places, those different cultures, those different backgrounds.
And worship in English.
But here's the thing, like, do we not know that there's going to be a heavenly language that we all speak?
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Is it like, do we know that people can be worshiping in Chinese, English, Spanish, German, whatever it is? I would say, I don't think we're given in Scripture that we know. Like, what if all of those languages don't exist anymore and there's new heavenly languages?
Right.
Then what do you do with your old ones?
Right.
I think even with that too, that way of thinking is one of my mom's heroes is Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor is a British man who stopped living in his British culture to be a missionary in China. But he wasn't just a missionary in China. He took on the dress, the style, the language. He cut his hair like Chinese people. So my question is, in what ethnic culture does he worship in heaven?
Right.
And the answer is, who cares?
Right.
Because the focus is Christ.
Right.
And this is what happens when you too much over-realized eschatology now is that you assume that your idea of diversity now is the only right idea that's going to be diversity, quote unquote, diversity in heaven, right? And I would say we got to be really, really careful with that.
Well, it's interesting how even so, I think traditionally when you've read Matthew 28, make disciples of all nations, people have thought, okay, so make disciples of Nigerians and French people and Americans.
Right.
And then back, I think, in the 70s, the concept of people groups kind of came into focus. And a people group, we'd say, is like an ethno-linguistic group bound by certain culture and history and customs. So I think we have like several thousand people groups as used by that definition today.
Right.
But even that is a man-made definition of what a people is.
Yes.
So it's like, well, God's going to sort that out, right? But I think one of the things we can do is, we have taken our understanding of what peoples and ethnicity and nationality and culture are. We've assumed our understanding is what's going to carry through for all time and all eternity. And then an over-realized eschatology takes that and imports it into our context.
Right.
And says that diversity that I understand the new heavens and new earth to be, every office needs to look like that. Every church needs to look like that. Every whatever needs to look like that.
Right.
And I know that's probably a controversial topic, and that's probably worth some more time. Maybe in the last podcast we'll do in the series will be like frequently asked questions. But I think forcing the diversity of heaven into your context is a way that we can over-realize our eschatology.
Yeah, and I think it might be helpful to talk about where we've landed on this for our church as well, because there's been a big push recently in the past, I would say 5 to 10 years that churches, well, not all churches, that predominantly white, like Caucasian churches, have to look a certain way. I think I said this in the last podcast. No one told the Chinese church I grew up in that we needed to match the ethnic diversity of the city we were in. Right, we were in Tucker, which is incredibly diverse.
Right,
there was only Chinese people there and like one white person.
Right.
I'm like, if we're going to apply this to everyone, why is it only Caucasian churches? I think, one, that's a question that's interesting. But two, I think it's, I think where we've landed at church is that we want to be diverse in the sense that we believe the gospel is for everyone, and we will never, ever withhold the gospel from someone because of their ethnicity or just their culture.
Sure.
Right? So their socioeconomic status, like everyone is welcome, and we encourage everyone, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, rich, poor, you drive a van or you don't drive a van, I don't care, whatever category you have, you're welcome at our church. We want you there, and we want you to feel safe and comfortable in this place to know the gospel. But to put percentages that it has to match the ethnic percentages of our city,
right?
is impossible, because how can I ensure that, let's pretend 7% of our city is Asian, or our county.
Right.
How can I ensure that 7% of our church is Asian? How can you? I don't even know practically how you do that. Like, because whether people accept the gospel or not, I can't control that.
Right. Salvation belongs to the Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
So even if you percentage-wise shared, if you take who you shared the gospel with, if you shared the gospel with 100 people, and you shared with exactly the percentages of the
Sure, we'll share with 7 Asian people and
Yeah.
80 white people.
Right.
Yeah.
How can you guarantee those percentages will come to your church? Like,
Right.
To me, it's almost a hindrance. It's like puts too much pressure to have to be diverse, where your focus stops being the gospel and is focused on diversity.
Right. And it's if you want to use the fancy term, teleological, right? It's the wrong telos. We've said that the telos is actually God and worship of him. A part of that is the diversity.
Right.
Diversity isn't the telos. And so, yeah, I think one of our pastor friends, Matt Dye, who pastors M28 Church in Midtown, he has a great line where he says, I want my church to look like Christ.
Yeah.
And Christ redeemed a people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation. So I love that, because it's saying Christ is the focus. And of course, diversity is a part of that, because Christ, he says in John, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. So he has sheep from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation. And we would love to display that. I think it takes intentionality to display that.
Right.
I think, run the risk of getting in trouble here, I think in general in America, white people tend to think that culture is neutral.
Right.
And what I mean is their culture is neutral. That's what they think, but that's because that's the majority culture they're around.
Yes,
so
agreed.
I think white people in America can tend to think, well, we're open to all cultures, but never take the introspective time to ask the tough questions. Are there some things that you're doing that are unintentionally putting roadblocks in front of certain cultures that you're not even aware of? And could you, for the sake of the gospel and evangelism and the worship of Christ, could you be more intentional about discovering those roadblocks and trying to remove some? Some you can't. We worship in English. Well, I mean, maybe you could have a translator and offer earbuds to people in Spanish.
Right.
That's a roadblock you could remove.
Right.
But you probably can't do it for every language.
Right.
So, I mean, some of it's missiological, but I think in general, and we'll get to the under-realized part, but, you can make too little of diversity, you can make too much of it.
Right.
We're on the too much side because we're under the first point. But,
right.
Yeah.
And I would say something that's helpful too is, do you know how we see more unity in terms of cultural and ethnic diversity in the church? It takes either at least one side and probably both sides from two different cultures to say, I will in my freedom give up my culture for the sake of the gospel.
My culture is secondary to the worship
and
of
it
Christ.
takes, so for example, like the church I grew up in, there have been talks, all Chinese church, we need to change the way we do some stuff because we do things very Chinese culture here.
Sure.
To be more open to Americans, whether, whatever the race. And there are a lot of people in that church that say, we refuse.
Right.
We don't want to. We want to worship this way.
Yep.
Does that mean a white guy like you can't ever worship there? No, but what would it take? It would take you, because they refuse to budge.
Right.
It would take you to say,
Yep.
hey, if they're still preaching the gospel, I'm willing to say, I'm going to worship in a different way, even though I'm uncomfortable, because I'm still worshiping God.
Right.
Now, so it could go both ways. So if you are coming from a different culture, you as the attender of a church, like if you're a minority attender of the church, and I mean minority, whether it's ethnicity or just culture or whatever,
Sure.
you will probably have to, in your freedom in Christ, say, this is different. I'm a little uncomfortable.
I'm going to
but I'm going to
lay my rights down.
Lay my rights down.
Yeah.
And we believe as a church, we want to hear from you and say what will make you more comfortable, and say we are also going to use our freedom to lay our rights down. But I think part of it, which it gets a little practically nuanced, is our worship pastor, for example, is a white guy, and he's like, I'd love to be more diverse in the music that we play. And he's told us this, but he's like, I can't sing some of these songs.
Yeah, he has a personal cultural limit to his
right?
ability.
So
right.
So what do we do? Like fire him?
Right.
No, of course not. Right. And so I think there is just some practicality to say, I think a lot of churches are now becoming more aware of this, but there's not one right way to do this.
Well, in the other part of it is like from a missiological aim. Look, I want the whole world to know about Christ, and especially like a first generation Chinese family, I'm probably not your guy to reach them. They need that Chinese church to have a very Chinese flavor church.
100%.
Language, culture, music. And so for me to say, well, they need to make sure they get more white people at that Chinese church, I'm like, actually, you know what? You just reach people with the gospel. And you go from the Chinese angle, I'll go at the English channel, and we'll meet you in Revelation 7. And I think we can lose that sometimes, which is sometimes there are legitimate cultural reasons to aim the gospel in a specific cultural context.
Right.
But I think so. Over-realized eschatology can be making the diversity of heaven a requirement for every nook and cranny of society and the church. Another way we can over-realize our eschatology, and this is touchy too, and hang with.
Do you want me to read it? So you.
Well,
I'll take the.
It's black and white thinking too much, and here's what I mean by that. Sometimes in these conversations about race and justice, we can be 100% confident that our understanding of the situation and of what justice requires in this particular situation is right. And I'm saying we will all have perfect sight in the new heavens and the new earth. But right now we see dimly. We don't see things perfectly. Our fallen nature results in we don't have a perfect ability to see every situation for as it truly is.
Yes.
So sometimes I fear in conversations about race and ethnicity, we're too confident in our own faculties to be able to see everything in a true light.
Right.
And so I think a little more humility is required of all of us.
Right.
To say, like, I may not be seeing this situation perfectly truthfully, and I may not be 100% right on what true justice requires in this circumstance.
So here's my thought on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, because we haven't talked about this yet. But we need to take a step back whenever a situation comes up, especially as it's publicized in the news. We need to take a step back and take a deep breath and not assume what's actually happening and who's right or wrong right away without, one, getting the facts, right, getting more information, and two, putting on your gospel glasses and going through this process first to make your decision.
Sure.
Because I think what we've seen for a long time is you have, for example, we've talked a lot about Jim Crow, where, a lot of what we see today is white cops, violence against unarmed black people, right? That's what you hear a lot in the news. And I think what you got in Jim Crow and before is you talk about like the disgusting nature of like lynching.
Yeah.
You have a lot of white people who just turned a blind eye and just assumed the white person was right. Right?
Sure.
And so you're saying, well, I made a justice judgment that this white guy, my neighbor, white guy, is right. Not going to question it. Just
Yep.
go on with life.
Yep.
And now I think we've almost too overly corrected that. Where now where you see is because that happened for a long time, and thankfully there are laws and that is being corrected,
Sure.
right, over time, like at least from top down, right? But you have this overcorrection. Now, anytime a lot of people see any new thing on the news, whether you read it or you see it, and it's a white cop and a unarmed black person,
Sure.
you just assume the white cop is in the wrong.
Right.
That the black guy's completely innocent. And so we cry justice, right? But I think for me, as I've seen about all of the things that's happened in the past 18 months, I won't say which ones. I think there are some where it's like, yeah, it's come out. That was unjust, and we need justice. We need to change that. We need to change, like, what that cop did was obviously in the wrong.
Sure.
But I also think in the past year, we've seen a lot of situations happen where people are crying justice, but the unarmed black man might have actually done something criminal, and what was just was what the cop did. Mm-hmm. And that's, once again, like, that's like a cancel-worthy statement, what I just said.
Right.
But I think what we need to do is to say things aren't just anytime you see something in the news where it's a white cop against a black like man or woman, we can't say injustice until we have more information, right? Things aren't black and white, like black and white in terms of clarity of if we know exactly what happened,
right,
and what's in the heart of the two people, and to make a judgment. And I think that point is we just assume who was in the wrong, and so we make a justice declaration that it needs to head towards this, where sometimes I would say it wasn't injustice. Sometimes it was definitely injustice, and we need to cry that.
Right.
And we need to head towards a solution that is just. But sometimes it's not. And I think we need to be careful in taking a step back before I think we make those judgment calls.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's we have to know that our ability to see all of these circumstances are not always maybe as clear as we would like it to be. Now, if you're getting frustrated with us, I'd say just hold on to point two.
We're gonna hit
go
the other
other
side
direction.
too.
But I just think we need to be very careful that we're not 100% confident when things are not. So here's like another example. So some things are black and white.
Yes.
There's murder. There's not murder. Right. I mean, there's
right.
But some things are not. So take dangerous opening this, but so take inequities among races, whites and blacks, for example, within our country, economically. So there are a few ways you can look at this, right? I mean, you have the effects of redlining,
right,
which we've talked about. Literally circling certain areas and saying black people can't get mortgages here.
Yeah.
So even if that's not happening...
Once again, not that long ago.
Yeah, even if that's not happening today, that was not happening that long ago, and the generational wealth impact is huge. All right, so that's
because so if you're wondering, real estate is the best and fastest way to develop wealth.
Right.
So
that's like
and if you can't, if you're like, whether it's redlining or not, if you have like, even 60, 70 years ago, most mortgage brokers were white, and even if there weren't laws against it, and they were refusing based on subconscious bias. I want you to call it conscious bias.
Sure.
Well, that does affect generational wealth. I mean, it really does. Yeah.
So that's a very legitimate factor.
Right.
You have access to education.
Right.
Especially in those communities.
Right.
It's extremely subpar to what the average white suburbanite is going to get. Right, so those are structural things. But then you also have the reality that children growing up in two-parent households do much better in every sense, academically, economically, socially, mentally.
Right.
There is a disparity, right, among black and white people on marriage rates and divorce rates and single-parent households and things of that nature. So when you're talking about justice, even from an economic standpoint, between two different races, the solution to that may not be as clear-cut as you would like it to be.
Right.
And it's probably, yes, it's probably an all-of-the-above approach, right? But are you addressing marriage and the importance of not having sex till you're married, the importance of, if you do have a baby, getting married, staying together, having a stable two-parent household? Are you addressing the effects of redlining, real estate, how that's played in? Are you addressing education and what we need to do to change the education system to make sure that every child, regardless of where they are born and grow up, get an equal access to high-quality education?
Right.
But none of that is quite as simple as we would like it to be. I know all of us would, in general, if you lean to the left, you want to take societal things and say, we need to fight for justice in the education system, in the real estate world, and address these structural, systemic things. If you're on the right, you tend to pick the personal morality and say, we need abstinence education in schools, and we need to teach people to stay together and develop strong two-parent households and these things. But I love what Tim Keller says. He says the left blames it on the system, the right blames it on morality, but no one blames it on the kid. Right? And the question is, how can we help the kid?
Right.
And that's not an easy answer. And I think an over-realized eschatology overemphasizes our ability to be 100% right in the approach. And I'm just saying, we still live in a fallen world. We need some humility to have long discussions with people about how to better our society. Last one, and
I just want to tag on to that too. And we assume we can create policies and vote people in to create policies that will bring us that utopia.
That will create the utopia. And it's also not that simple.
And what I'm saying is we shouldn't try to bring kingdom living here. We should.
Yes.
But we should have the realization that no matter what happens, no matter what policies are put in place, no matter what happens, we still live in a broken world on this side of eternity.
So here's a great example of that. The crime bill in the 90s, signed by Bill Clinton, right? In the 80s, there's a wave of crime going through most American cities,
right?
Or late 80s or early 90s. And, most people today, if you watch documentaries, and I'm not trying to make a political statement here, but most people today try to blame Republicans for this authoritarian crime bill that happened in the 90s. Well, Bill Clinton, a Democratic president, signed it. My understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, send us an email, is the Congressional Black Caucus pushed for harsher penalties for drug crimes because their communities
were getting destroyed. Yeah.
Now, we have discovered over the last 20 years that bill had some serious flaws in it.
Right.
And resulted in the mass incarceration of pretty much an entire generation of black men.
Right.
We can get into that on a whole nother level. But you could look at it and say that the motives were evil.
Right.
And maybe some were during that crime bill. But my guess is a lot of the motives were righteous and pure.
Right. From the Black Caucus.
Right.
I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
Right? But no, like, we never talk about stuff like that.
Right.
You know?
But my point is, even a bill that intended to further justice in society and law and order and create a stable environment for people to live in and raise their families in had some serious flaws that they weren't aware of. That now the bill a couple of years ago under the Trump administration that was passed tried to correct some of that stuff on the
right.
mass incarceration side. But that's the point, right? Is we still live in a fallen world. We make attempts at justice, even those we're going to find out later there were some serious flaws in them. And so we can't create utopia. I think that's the main thing that we need to realize on an over-realized eschatology.
And I have a statement I just came up with that may be helpful to see.
Please share.
We need to figure out how how I can be and live out a godly life. How can I be godly in a broken world?
Yeah.
But instead, oftentimes what we do is, how can we change broken people in my idea of a godly world, right? We tend to say everyone else, the problem was with everyone else, the system, the experience I had with these people, and I know what godliness should be, so they all need to change.
Right.
But really, I think where we are called to as Christians is say, how can I be a godly person in this broken world, and change things from that perspective, right? So
that's good. That's good. All right, and the last point that we have for the danger of an overrealized eschatology, we made up a bunch of words. We're calling this overly local cultural theologizing.
And I'll speak into this a little bit because I think it's important, is that what we have often done with this idea is that we have created a perfect new heavens and new earth based on our American earth.
Yep.
Right? And I think what we should be careful is to understand that when we think about racial tensions and how the gospel speaks into it, most Americans only think about American issues.
Right.
So, for example, diversity issues in America are almost purely black and white. That's how it's talked about.
Right. And you're like, hello?
Well, it's funny because I worked for a ministry where they sent out this diversity survey every year, and the only questions were about how many black students did you get? How many black students did you get on this event and this? And I'm like, wait a second. How can you call this a diversity survey and not include all the other minorities? Right? What are you doing? They were attempting to reach this idea of new heaven, new earth, where all people tribe and language, but the way they applied it was only through American lens, where it was black and white, and not realizing that there are more than, as an American, there are more ethnic issues than black and white.
Yeah.
Because there's white and Asian, white and black,
right?
Hispanic and Asian, Hispanic, Asian and black, Hispanic, Asian, black and white. Like there's endless possibilities you can have here, right? I think the other thing too is to understand that this isn't the only place that racism exists is not America.
Yeah.
This is a world problem.
Yeah, because it's a
and so
problem.
Understand when you are thinking through this issue, this sin issue, and then what is the gospel solution, we need to think about it not just as Americans, but as people who live on this earth with many different cultures and ethnicities. For example, like talking to a buddy of mine from South Africa, racism is, I would say, worse there and more obvious there than it is here.
Sure.
And I would say some of the biblical conclusions they've come up with are different. And I think it's good for us to realize there are other Christians around the world dealing with this too. And then this isn't just a here issue, because it kind of feels like that. Yeah,
that's a great point.
So just wanted to say that real quick.
We can, and we actually do this, I think, in our eschatology a lot. I think this is actually one of the products of large influence of dispensationalism in America is we think how things are going in America is actually like the center of biblical prophecy for the end of the world.
Right.
So like the world could be prospering, but things are bad in America, and we're like, it's the mark of the beast. It's coming. Like, these are the signs of the times. So,
like, I've heard like Christianity's dying. I'm like, yeah, maybe in terms of numbers from 30 years ago in America,
right?
But not in China or the Middle East or Africa. Yeah.
So it's almost like an ethnocentrism that we can have,
right?
That can play into an over-realized eschatology.
Yeah, whether you're what color your skin is, but if you're American, we all have one thing in common, is that we think we're better than everyone else. And so we also think that our problems are worse than everyone else's, right? So
for sure. So that's part one, the dangers of an over-realized eschatology. If you've been radically uncomfortable for the last few minutes. Hey, we're here for you. Point number 2, the dangers of an under-realized eschatology. So what happens when you don't even consider the telos at all? What happens when you don't consider the end goal of every tribe, tongue, language, nation worshiping before the throne in a new heavens and a new earth? What happens when you don't realize that enough in your day-to-day thinking? Two broad things with kind of 2 subpoints under each. The first is this. Well, problems will be here forever. Sin's here forever. So why fight against it?
Right.
Apathy.
Right.
If you there's going to be sin until God creates the new heavens and the new earth. So slavery is just part of it.
Right.
Redlining's just part of it.
Right.
Jim Crow's just a part of it. Separate but equal is just a part of it. We can fall into this apathy that isn't true of what Christ has called us to be salt and light here and now.
Right.
If you think this way, you think about like William Wilberforce and the Christian ethic he used to abolish slavery in England. That never would have happened with an under-realized eschatology.
Right.
Of like, what's the point?
Right. Wilberforce, first of all, cool name.
What a guy.
Read up on him.
Yeah.
Cool story.
Yeah.
And he was a Christian. And
his Christianity drove him to abolish slavery.
I think it's easy to say, and I think I've heard this. This is me as an Asian guy speaking about white people I've talked to. Mm-hmm. I think you generally see this a little bit more with white Americans. I think some white Americans overcorrect to an realized eschatology,
right?
And then some who I've heard this a lot, where it's like, "Well, I never owned slaves, so
right.
I've never been, I've never, called someone the N-word, or I've never, thought about someone differently because of their race. So this isn't my problem."
Yep. There are plenty of problems in the world. We just can't fix them all.
We can't fix them all. Not my problem.
Yep. I didn't do it.
It's going to be fixed in heaven.
Yep.
Not my problem. And I would say, well, no, that's not the Christian. That's not the Christian worldview. That's not the Christian ethic.
Right.
Right. Where the only sin that the gospel covers in my life is mine. That's not how this works.
Right.
Right. That we constantly there are things that we should constantly, and so, okay. In that defense, we can't as Christians do everything.
Sure.
But we definitely should be pro biblical justice in all situations, and con sin and evil in all situations.
Absolutely.
And so we should never be indifferent to sin.
Right.
And even if it's sin out there, we should never be indifferent to it.
Jesus' command to be salt and light, I think when you trace like a legitimate history of Christianity, you will see by and large when Christianity has taken over a culture, the marginalized are cared for, the poor are cared for, the outcast are cared for. I mean, there are so many stories of early Christians in the Roman Empire, 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, letters to the emperor saying, Emperor, we got a problem. These Christians, which they called pagans, which was funny. So we're the pagans to the Romans. They're taking care of our poor better than we are as a government.
Yeah.
This is actually creating a problem for us.
Right.
When plagues would enter cities, Christians would stay.
Right.
Everyone else would flee from the city. Christians would stay, take care of the poor, take care of the sick. And so in general, one of the ways that the gospel has spread has been the social actions of Christians that have stood for the oppressed and the vulnerable, and opened people's ears to like, oh, I'm going to listen to what they say about their God, because look how they care for the outcast. So I think it's a huge mistake to say, well, you just got to wait for God to fix it in the end. I mean, there are so many evil things. And here's the other irony on that one when it relates to race. I don't see any evangelicals saying that about abortion.
Right. Yeah, I thought about that too.
I mean, we're like, let's just be biblical here. Let's not be like the leanings to the left or the leanings to the right. Like, I don't know any evangelical that says, I mean, abortion is just part of life. It's just part of this world. And I don't really want to, we can't really do anything about it.
Right.
No, like, whether you think you should be serving in the crisis pregnancy center or whether you think you should be donating to political causes to help end it legally, I think every Christian, or just praying for it, every Christian would say, engage somehow. Well, so the same thing is true on the other side.
At the very least, pray. We could always pray.
So when you're dealing with racial injustice and racism, the same is true there. Don't do for that what you wouldn't do for abortion. Engage, pray. Don't just say, God, we'll just have to wait for God to fix it.
And I will say this might be one of the most simplest but helpful things you can do. So when there is ethnic tension, right? So in America, a lot of times, once again, black and white, but it can happen anywhere, right? When there's ethnic tension, or even like after 9/11, if, for example, if there was racism against Middle Eastern people, right?
Yep.
My question is, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, no matter where you land, if you're over or under realized your eschatology, before you come to your conclusion and speak, speak out or stay silent, have you talked to someone?
A real human being that's not on Twitter?
Yeah, a real human being that's not on Twitter about this issue who's going through it.
Right.
I know that sounds really simple, but I think the problem is you got a lot of yelling, and no one's really talking to each other, because I remember stuff that happened last summer and I jumped to some conclusions, and then I was like, maybe I shouldn't jump to conclusions. A good friend at our church is African American, and you know what? We had hours-long conversation, and it was incredibly helpful.
Well, right.
It was helpful for him to hear my thoughts. It was helpful for me to hear his thoughts and get his background and how he was thinking about this. And you know what? I think we both came away loving the Lord and each other more.
Yeah, you said hours-long conversation. We're already an hour on this podcast. Sorry. If you've made it this far, congratulations. These conversations take time.
Yeah.
They're not, how many characters are allowed on Twitter now? 250?
I don't know. I don't tweet.
But you can't have this conversation in 250 characters. It takes time. But yeah, I think you should really question your views if you want to just kind of say, yeah, we live in a broken world. It's not my problem. I didn't own slaves.
Yeah.
God will have to fix it in heaven.
Not my problem. They need to do this. Right? But
if they would just fill in the blank, this would be a problem. That's not a way to engage as a Christian.
And I have found I have had a lot more compassion when I understand where people are coming from.
Yep.
And I'll say this. One of the most helpful things is comments I've ever heard about anything is things are understandable, but they're not always acceptable, right?
Yeah.
And here's the thing. If someone is hurting and has been hurt and then is reminded about their own hurts from a situation that's happening in the country, not every single application that person comes up with is going to be right.
Sure.
But you know what we can all do? Try to understand that person to understand how they ended up with their conclusions. And here's the thing. Maybe you have landed on the right biblical conclusion, and maybe you haven't. But the way I can help you lead you to the right biblical conclusion is not by telling you it's your own fault. I don't really care. That's not how I help you come to the right biblical conclusion.
Right.
It's by listening and loving.
Yeah.
And And if anything, that could be the first step every single person can take towards anyone else. Here specifically, we're talking about ethnic tensions, but in anything is to say, let me just talk to you in person and listen.
Yep.
And hear you.
We're going to get into that next week. The topic's going to be how to have these conversations. Yeah. The next point, the next danger of an under-realized eschatology, and this is the last one, is we don't think about diversity at all. This is the kind of I don't see color statement. You know, the point of the main point of heaven's about God, not about race.
Right.
It's like, you are right, but the Bible does go out of its way to
talk about
articulate that every tribe, tongue, language, and nation.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we just, brush past it and say, this is just really not something we need to be talking about. We don't need to talk about diversity. We just need to talk about God. Another way of this is like, there's no injustice going on here. Nothing to see here. There's just people have some inconveniences, and the world is broken, and that's just the way it is. Move on.
Right.
That's an under-realized eschatology.
Right. And yeah, I would say I've heard a lot of we don't need to talk about it. Let's just sweep it under the rug.
Yeah,
right?
But the reason we have tensions is that we talk about it too much.
And I would just say no. Like, we don't need to, I think for us in our preaching, we don't preach through series. So we don't ever have a race series. That's why we're doing this on this podcast.
This is our race series, yeah.
And that's what we're talking about here. Yeah. And we'll talk about the racial tensions if the scripture gives it to us on the week we're preaching. Yeah. I know I preached over it twice, over the 2 or 3 times over the past year. Yep. But we never had the race series, right? But I think we have to talk about it. We just have to.
Yeah.
Because if nothing else, it's just because it's important to people. And if I want to connect with you, I need to talk to you about what is important to you.
Yeah.
If nothing else, just from a conversational friend level, we have to address it. But I think it is an important thing that's going on in our culture right now that the Bible can and does
absolutely
speak into. And I think, even a helpful thing for me is just even ask, how can I help?
Yeah.
Right? It's so simple. What a simple question, but I think it's an important one, right? And so I would say, what I see most of the time is with people is actually ignorance and not hatred. You know what I mean? Or would you agree? Ignorance is just a big part of this equation a lot of times.
Sure.
And
there is hatred out there for sure.
No, for
but
sure.
There's a lot of ignorance.
At least in our community that most people I've talked to, most of the time when someone said something inappropriate to me, like a racial comment to me, it's been out of ignorance. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. Or if I've just heard it, it's been out of ignorance. Yeah. And even here, I would say if you fall in this category and you're ignorant, well, first you have to be aware. I am kind of ignorant on some of these issues, and then after recognizing your ignorance to say, well, I should learn.
Yep.
I should learn about some of these histories that maybe I've never been taught,
right,
or read about. Maybe I should go talk to someone who's experienced what's going on that I see out in the world, right? And then on the other side, I would say be patient, right? Could you imagine if we just me and you blew up at we study the Bible for a living. Could you imagine if we just blew up at people who didn't know anything about the Bible because they were just ignorant about it all the time? No, that's not how you teach. That's not how you teach someone. That's not how you initiate change.
Yeah.
It requires godly patience to love them.
Yeah, so, under-realized eschatology is saying we just don't need to think about it, don't need to talk about it. It's not something, God will sort it out in the end, and we can just be colorblind now. No, and, the other thing, too, is, God made us different.
Yeah, that's good.
And there are different cultures that are going to come together and worship him for all eternity. And so, I want to celebrate the God-honoring uniqueness of different cultures.
Right.
And every culture has unique things that can be celebrated. So celebrate them. Praise God that, people...
And that's important. Celebrate. Don't be neutral towards
Yeah,
it. Celebrate.
yeah.
We should celebrate different cultures.
Yeah, and praise God. And so as best as we can on this side of eternity, celebrate those things. We don't have to wait till eternity to celebrate the uniqueness of God-honoring aspects of different cultures.
And I would say, too, something I think someone in this unrealized eschatology I've heard a lot is like, my style of worship is the right way.
Right.
Right? Everyone, we will all worship like I worship, right?
Naturally.
Like, and so I've seen this a ton. Like, there's some people are like, the only way you should worship is a cappella hymns.
Yes, you Presbyterians. We're talking to you, you super
Some people
Presbyterians.
are like, the only way to worship is the guitar, youth group way of, when I think of.
Yes, you who were raised in the 1990s, we're talking to you.
But there's not one way. I think it's really cool. Like, something my wife, who is white and I'm Asian, has said to me is my dad will sometimes, we'll go eat with them and he'll pray in Chinese. And she's sometimes like, is almost in tears.
Absolutely.
Because it's like, she's like, it's so cool that people can worship in different ways.
I will never forget the first time I went on a mission trip to Costa Rica, junior or senior year of high school, and they were singing in Spanish a song I knew in English, and it brought me to tears.
Yeah. I learned an African song, a group went on a mission trip, came back and taught us the song, and it was like, it almost brought me to tears just to hear like I didn't even know what each individual word meant. I knew we were praising God.
Right.
And it was like, wow, it just brought to mind, there's someone in South Africa singing this song.
Yeah.
And they are praising God with me.
That's a beautiful
together.
thing.
It's a beautiful picture. And so let us realize that if we have under-realized eschatology, that it's not just about us. This world isn't just about me, right?
Yeah, that's good. So one day, Jesus is coming back, and he's going to set every wrong thing right, and he's going to make death work backwards and resurrect our bodies and give us new and imperishable eternal life in the new heavens and the new earth. And there will be people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation worshiping him, singing praises to him, a part of this new, perfected, redeemed humanity. That's the end. That's where we're going. And that should inform how we live out today. So thanks for hanging with us on this extra long podcast. We will be back next week continuing the series, talking about how do we have conversations about race within the body of Christ. Talk to you then.